And developing tonight, we are hearing new warnings from President Obama's own team when it comes to what one political writer is calling the worst Mideast crisis in a generation. Today, we heard reports that the Saudis would join with Egypt and more than half a dozen other countries, Arab countries, to try and contain threats from the country of Iran. Last week, the president's former ambassador to Iraq said President Obama's Mideast policy was in, quote, a G-damn free fall. And yesterday, the president's former director of defense intelligence echoed that sentiment.
Right now, we have almost a complete breakdown of order in the Middle East. A new Middle East is essentially struggling to be born. And right now, my sense of where the policy is at is sort of, and I hate to say it like this, but it's almost a policy of willful ignorance.
Joining me now, former ambassador to Iraq under President Obama, James Jeffrey, and Bret Stephens, who's the Wall Street Journal foreign affairs columnist. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. Ambassador, explain what you meant by the Middle East is in a free fall right now.
What I mean is the Middle East has always been a tough neighborhood ever since I got involved in 1974. But in the last few years, particularly with the Arab Spring beginning in 2011, the state system itself is under challenge from many actors, from their own populations in that region, from ISIS that has emerged in the last 2.5 years, from Al-Qaeda that's still out there, from Iran and its both Islamic and traditional imperialistic tendencies.
But let me ask you, so it's a mess on many fronts, and we've been covering that with Bret and others, many times here on the Kelly File. But it's extraordinary for you as an ambassador who worked for President Obama to come out and criticize his Mideast policy. What specifically are we doing wrong?
Specifically, whenever you have a crisis in particular, you follow basic tenets of American foreign policy. We're running a global security system since '45. You stay close to your allies even when they're difficult. Carter accepted the Shah of Iran at great cost to him because that's what you do with allies. You use military force, or at least threaten it. You don't shy away from it, and you try to be as consistent and predictable as possible. We don't see that right now. A lot of this seems to turn about, A, the willingness to not to use military force, that there's no military solution to anything, and secondly, the pursuit of an agreement with the Iranians under any circumstances.
Bret, I know that you've written that this is the most inept foreign policy in U.S. history. Is that hyperbole, or you really believe it?
Well, think of where the analogs might be. The Carter administration at least had the achievement of the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, even though it lost, of course, it famously lost Iran. It's hard to see a place in the Middle East where this administration has left anything other than a vacuum that's now being filled by our most serious and determined enemies, and Yemen is simply the last shoe to drop. One of the things which the ambassador pointed out, and I think it's important, we have friends or potentially close friends in places like Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. For the most part, we are keeping all of those at arm's length at best when we are not actually in a squabble with them as we are with Israel.
Well, could it be that President Obama thinks, okay, I've got them. I don't need to work on them. I need to work on these other ones.
Well, no, on the contrary, because the danger, and take a country like Saudi Arabia, is Israel's always going to be a close friend of the United States, almost no matter what, because our values are so aligned. But Saudi Arabia is increasingly pursuing a freelance foreign policy. If we're prepared to give the Iranians a threshold nuclear capability, the Saudis are going to demand a threshold nuclear capability. And then we're off to the nuclear races in the Middle East. That's a really terrifying prospect. And I don't think this administration is really thinking through past the second and third move of what it's doing if it's thinking through the first move.
What do you think of that, Ambassador? Is it ineptitude? Is it ideology? That we just don't want anything to do with this region, so we're going to retreat. What is it?
I think it's a little bit of the latter. It is an ineptitude. I know President Obama. He's very smart. He has a plan. The plan is, I would say, to wean us from what he would say is the overuse of military force in international relations, to rely more on local forces throughout the regions, and, as we just heard, to reach out, as you pointed out, to reach out to those who have been opposing to us to show that we're willing to be their friends. The problem with that is they're not enemies of international stability, be it Iran, Russia, or China, or ISIS, because of us or because of what we do. They're enemies of international order because they hate it and want to set up their own competing order. They're a threat to all of us.
When you were with the administration, would President Obama listen to criticism like that?
Oh, absolutely. But in the end, he's going to take decisions that he thinks is good for the American people. He looks at the polls. He cites the polls, and his people do all of the time. Most Americans want to see a deal with Iran. Most Americans don't like to use military force, particularly in the Middle East. So he rides on that. And the problem is it's not achieving results. If it was achieving results, I could see it. I could understand it. It isn't.
You know, Megyn, the president, I think, like a lot of Americans, understandably wishes that we could just look away from the Middle East and never have to think about it. Again, the region is complex, and the problems always come back to harm us. But, you know, to paraphrase Leon Trotsky, you may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in you. From Yemen, we have the most serious terrorist threat to the homeland. Getting out of Iraq, to a large extent, bequeathed us to ISIS, and not involving ourselves early enough in the Syrian conflict did that as well. The Iranians are a threat to our national security, never mind that of the Israelis or our partners.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, two smart dudes. Ambassador, thank you. Bret Stephens, thank you, too. It's a pleasure speaking to you both.
Good being here.
Thank you.